If you want to paint some realistic and natural looking waves on water, you need to know two main things. The first thing is, what is the shape of a wave? Waves have a basic shape that all of the bigger shapes are made of. The next thing you're going to want to know is, what is the color of those waves and how to appropriately place the colors within that shape. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the shape of a wave. So waves have high points and low points. So when I say wave, you might think of just one little spike in the water. But another sense of the word is a pattern. So you could go like this, and this could be a wave. High points, low points. So this is commonly called the crest. This is commonly called the trough, but I like to call them smiles and frowns. This is the smile, this is the frown. And in water, the smiles are almost always wider than the frowns. You can see that my frowns are a little bit smaller than my smiles. So when you stand on the beach and you see the waves rolling in, you see those long strips of a big wave starting to break and crash on the sand. And so let's say that this is sliced in half and each of these is one of those long waves. I just splattered my board here. Well, so a wave can be that long shape, but another kind of wave you always see is the little spikes. Well, what causes those little spikes is intersecting waves. So if we think of a wave as this, let's say we have a bird's eye view here, and I'm just going to do a little drawing down here. And you've dropped a rock in a pond, and it's making ripples go out like this. And then you drop another rock over here, and it's going to make more ripples go out like this. Okay, so there's a resulting pattern here, and you can see that it makes these little diamond shapes. So if each one of these lines is a crest, then wherever they cross, there's going to be, let's just say twice as much of whatever matter these waves are made of. It's going to pile up and get real big. And wherever the low areas cross, it's going to go even lower. So then you have what is commonly called a super crest and a super trough. That would be right. This is a crest, so the super trough would be this empty space in here. That's not real important stuff. I'm just showing you that the single little spike that you see on ocean water when you're out at sea is usually the result of these intersecting waves. So because they are a three-dimensional object that's like a pyramid coming up, they have a three-dimensional shape, and so that's where I start with my strategy on how to shade those waves and cause them to look like real waves, is understanding that it's a three-dimensional, like a Hershey's kiss just coming up out of the water, okay? So you go like this, basic wave shape. I use this in all the waves that I paint. This is the left side of a single wave intersection that I'm gonna from here on out call a wave, but it's really two waves intersecting, causing a spike to rise up out of the water, because that's such a common sight when you're looking at a beach scene or looking out at the sea or at a lake. You see those spikes of water coming up everywhere. So I'm gonna just call that a wave, even though it's really two waves intersecting each other. So we'll say this is the left side of that shape coming up, and this is the right side. Now look at my brush stroke. See how I let it get bigger by pushing my brush harder as it swoops down into the trough. So when I make the smiles, I make them big and open. See? Skinny at the top, big and open. So bigger smiles than my frowns. This is a smaller shape altogether, the crests of these waves. So there's not going to be as much of the reflection on top visible as there will be reflection in the trough, because since this trough I know is bigger this way, it's also bigger this way. In all directions, it's bigger than this more pointy top of the wave. So this, if it's my reflection, is going to cover more area on my painting. And then these little points are going to cover less area. So I make these bigger, I make these skinnier and smaller. That's the basic brush stroke that I use when I'm creating waves. So then I might do another layer of them. I might make another wave down here, and it's closer to me, and my brush stroke looks like that. Get a little water on my brush. Like this. And then I try to taper it off, you know. And if it's just little, it's a lot easier to do it real clean. Just one brush stroke like that. And I try to always have every brush stroke taper so that it's skinnier as it swoops up and fatter as it dips down. That immediately gives me a little bit more of a three-dimensional look to my waves. That's the way that the highlights will appear on top of them, is in shapes that are similar to that. Okay, now this is starting to get confusing with all this going on. So let me paint this blue and then switch to white. Now regardless of whether I'm making little tiny waves that are just in a little pond or a puddle, or if I'm making real big waves that are in the ocean, they still have those rules to them that the smiles are bigger than the frowns, or the trough is a larger area than the crests of those waves. And so I might have very basic shapes like I just now showed you if I'm doing a real small body of water. But if I'm doing something big, I'm going to use a lot of those brush strokes to form one larger wave. Let's do the same thing. This is one wave, and I'm just going to go down like this, and it's going to be skinnier where it is at its high point, and I'm going to broaden that brush stroke as it comes down to the low point, and sometimes just angling my brush downward a little bit and tilting it this way can cause it to taper and make a nice gradient. Look how it fades to the top right there and then stays sharp right here. But that's something I might or might not want to use. It's just a little bonus brush technique, you know, if you want to use that. When I'm doing ocean waves, I like to always taper all of my brush strokes upward, but I don't want to get too far off track here. The important thing right now is that we follow this basic shape. So remember this, you know, like some kind of a bird or something, where it's getting wider as it goes down, skinnier as it goes up. Think of that as one wave. Now watch what happens when I have a wave in front of a wave. Now if this were a small body of water, you probably wouldn't see these real sharp corners because the waves don't have such abrupt changes. All the water has surface tension, so all of the corners are very rounded where the water is trying to even itself out, so it keeps everything real rounded. So it might be more like this if it's on a real small scale, a lot more than if it was on a big scale. You'd have the corners rounded. So I'll just round them by pulling this light color in and losing that sharp corner. Now look at this resulting shape. Notice that this smile, because it's wider, the bottom edge of the stroke is not at the same curve as the top edge of the stroke. This is more level, and the result of that is my wave is like a little mountain. It has a flatter bottom than the top. The top has more of an arch. Now that could be at any extreme. It might be just barely arced. It might be stretched out real long, but typically this base has a more level bottom than this top. Where I have this line scrunched down, well, I have sharper angles that are swooping back. So this trough right here may never reach a sharp angle where it's tilting away from my eyes. And as I've explained before, as the surface of water tilts toward me like I'm looking through a window, I see less reflection. But as it tilts away from me, I begin to see more and more reflection. And it's gradual. It's not a sudden point where you suddenly see reflection. So that's why these lines taper. Well, because of that, this is a more sudden curve wrapping around the point of this wave, where down near the base is a lot more of a gradual curve. And so I'm going to have angles on the top of this and on this downward swoop that are tilting more away from my eyes than the angles that might be right in the middle of this smile right here, or the trough. This might be relatively level, but then these here are really turning away. The result of that is that it's brighter. You'll see, well, I should say, has more reflection. The reflection could be a darker color than the water itself, but we'll say that it's a bright sky, and so it's going to be brighter. And this is where we get into adding color within the shape of the wave, so that you have two things now defining the wave. You have the shape and you have color placement. So I have a brighter reflection on this area right here. And notice that I let it taper out and not be as bright as it comes down into the trough. If you're putting highlights on waves, that's where you want to put them for the most part, is on this downward swooping edge. And then not so much right in here. It's not that that can't happen. I'm just talking about what is typical so that you have a basic layout that looks good for your waves. So that's the basic shape and how to put the reflection on it. So now what does that look like when we use this basic shape to build bigger, more complex waves? Now, one more important thing to note about this is that you're inevitably going to have these smiles connecting with these frowns. I have my frown right here, I have a smile right here. So the way to do that is you just connect them. You put them together. But then where you put the brightest area is still according to this basic shape. So as my picture gets more complex because things are interconnecting, I still maintain my knowledge of where the colors are going according to where they are on the wave. So I might have a reflection on the top of another wave right here, coming down right here. Okay, so then my bright colors still are not in this whole thing. They're still, my brightest area is still right here on the edge of this wave, on the edge of this one, on the edge of this one coming down, and this one coming down, and then it's not so bright down here in the middle, but then it might get brighter and brighter as it gets just to this very little edge. And just this little tiny bright edge can actually give a lot of depth and perspective to the overall shape of your waves as they are interconnecting. When you have that consistent pattern of that color getting brighter right at the top of this, it causes it to look like it suddenly swoops up and it has that sharper little tip on it. And so then it could gradually swoop back down like this if it's on a smaller wave. And this might be my paint starting to dry now. You know, maybe I can just use my fingers. Might have a more gradual gradient. And it might be sharper if it's like a big wave on the ocean and it's spiking up as it's splashing against itself. But still, the rule remains that this is the tiniest area and the brightest area of the reflection. Right there. And then, of course, the exception to that, don't you love exceptions, would be if you have, let's say, a big bright sun right there and it's just reflecting right square off every angle that's completely level. You know, it's right there. So every angle that's facing right at that sun is going to have the reflection of it. So in that case, you might just have white all over this, you know, all through your water, and then you have the reflection. So I'll make a big wave now, and I'm going to use the exact same pattern that I just showed you with that simpler picture. And I'm going to make sure that each stroke has that same pattern to it. See how it tapers on the ends? And then I tried to make it so that it has this gradient fading upward, because that causes it to look like it's swooping. Like this one stroke is a little miniature trough. And so I'm going to have my little smiles, and I'm going to connect the end of it with some point on the midsection of another, you know, or I can do them end to end like this, see? So now I just kind of did a miniature version of that whole picture with just a few brush strokes. All right, so I can do several of these. And let's just not make the edge of this wave completely straight. Let's make it ramp up a little bit. Now I'm going to use a lot of that same kind of stroke to build the same shape that I just painted. So you can see that this is like one big stroke made out of many little ones of the same shape. Water gradually tilts away from you and you gradually see more of the reflection. So there's not going to be a sudden point where I see reflection unless that really is just a completely flat face on that wave. So I'll probably want to put a few like this, getting dimmer. So you're seeing less of the reflection. So I'll make them smaller. There's less and less of that angle that will allow you to see a reflection as it curves around into what would be like a window to the deep water. Let's make another one here. Now, down here, I'm going to have another big smile that's just like this one. So this maybe is the top. So this is a frown right here. So I'm going to make it brighter. It's brighter because it's tilting way away from my eyes. It's swooping like this. So this angle is the sharpest angle away from where I'm looking, and it's facing the most toward all of the sky back there that it would be reflecting. See? But I can still blend it into my picture. Okay, and here's my big smile down here. Now see, that's a very bright color. I don't want it to be that bright, so I'm going to pull those colors out. This is a larger area with a more gradual curve, so as this gets bigger, the bottom of this wave becomes more level. But I don't want to make it completely level. This is a technique I use a lot where I just kind of dry off the excess paint in my brush and then I drag it across paint that's been sitting there for a few seconds. And sometimes it does a real good job of smoothing it out, blending it. Now let's say that down here is the tip of another wave. So we'll make a little frown, little frowny face right here. And I'm going to make sure it's a little bit brighter than the rest of that smile that's right above it. The bright area of the wave is that from the tip of it swooping down on this downward angle. Put the bright spot right there. Same thing on this guy, have my bright spot. You can see a pattern of waves starting to emerge here. So then let's not just keep repeating the exact same pattern. So I've got a wave here, here, here. So if I put another one up here, that'd be like the exact same pattern. So we'll offset it a little bit. We'll put one here now. So when I make big waves out of little waves, I can have many little waves, many little crests within the low spot. I can have a bunch of little waves. You know, I have waves within waves is what I'm trying to say. And that's just because I'm just using the same brush stroke. and it just naturally creates that look of waves by the way I connect the strokes together and keeping the tops of the waves skinny and then widening everything as it gets into those troughs. See, so when you come in and you do highlights on your waves, it really helps if you know the most advantageous place to put those highlights. If you put them here on this downward swooping edge, it's most likely to look like natural waves the way they occur in nature, with that angle catching all that reflection of the sky or the sun or whatever's behind it. Right here I can put a nice bright highlight. Here's an edge swooping down. Okay, now that I've showed you the basic shape and how to build bigger shapes out of that basic shape that resemble the same basic shape, I want to show you how to now apply perspective to that so that it looks like these waves are on the surface of the water, maybe the ocean. So the first thing I'm going to do to apply perspective is establish my horizon, where it disappears off the edge of the earth, right? The horizon is where the earth ends and you fall off the edge if you walk any further. That's what the horizon is. Now I want you to notice that I'm making very distant water, and so I'm just assuming that there are no angles on that are facing straight toward me, like a window, like when I'm looking down at these waves. So I'm just making everything lighter. As it gets further away, there's overall more reflection. So I'm just going to quickly put a light color there. I'll lay down my underwater color first, and as I get further away or toward the horizon, I make a gradient that changes to the color of what's above the water, which would be the sky. So I'd make it gradually changing. See this gradient I'm creating? It gradually becomes more the color of the sky, and that immediately adds perspective without even painting any shapes. That adds perspective. So when you're making a road in perspective, you'll make your triangle. You have a road going back, and then you have your little dotted line coming down the road. But we can't do that with these waves, because these waves, they're not a big long object that vanishes to a vanishing point. So I have to use a different method. So I'm going to use the rule of halves and doubles that I've explained in my perspective video. And that rule is very simple. Rule of halves and doubles. If the distance doubles, the size of the object is half. If the size of the object doubles, then the distance is half. So, rule of halves and doubles, I know that if I want this wave to be twice as far away, then I just need to make it 1/2 the size. So, what is twice as far away? That's the question. Where do I put it? Well, it would be halfway to the horizon. That's why I made the horizon first. So I know that I can put a wave in here. Every time I cut the distance to the horizon in half, that means that the distance is twice as far as what it was where my measuring point started. So from here, it doesn't matter what this distance is. Let's say this wave is 20 feet away. Well, if I go halfway to my horizon, so right about here, then that distance, whatever it was here, is double at that halfway mark. So that means that it's 40 feet away right here, and the rule of halves and doubles says that that needs to be only half of the width and half of the height of this wave. So roughly, it does not need to be exact, roughly that big. This is a good guideline when I'm doing something that is appearing in much more random placement than like a building or a road that has a big shape that you can put in perspective. I could just draw a triangle like I did for something like that, but not so with these waves. So halves and doubles, we have this size at this distance, okay, and then that means that halfway to the horizon, it's going to be half again. So I have roughly this size right here, and then when I get halfway to the horizon, it's going to be roughly that size. Okay. And then halfway to the horizon again is going to be half that size. Now I have a good guide. So these are just going to be tiny little guys up here. Look how extreme that change is. It's real extreme so suddenly, because look how I placed my picture. I put the horizon very close to these big waves in my foreground. I could have put it way up here, like if I was looking down at the water, then I might have the horizon way up there. But if I'm just down close to the water looking out to sea, that's kind of how this is placed, where I have the horizon very close to my foreground. So it's going to appear like I'm down in it. Now I have a guide just for my size. That's all that's for, is just to give me a reference for the size of my waves. I have it in my mind how small I want to make the waves, and so I don't make these reference points, but I'll just make diagonal lines, and I'll be imagining them going off to a point. So I might start down here and just work my way up. I'm making these lines right here, and I come up this way, and I just work in a diagonal line. And then I'll bend it this way and then work in a diagonal line this way. But, I do that because I can. But this is probably an easier way to think about it, is understanding what size these need to be at the different heights in the picture. You take your time. Take your time and just try to do it right. And then with familiarity, you get much quicker, like reading a book. It used to be when I would look at water, I was mystified by the constant appearance of chaos, just churning and moving everywhere. What's happening? The more I looked at it, the more it became familiar to me. And now when I look at it, I know what's happening. I see it all makes sense to me. I can see the colors inside of colors, and they're all following the rules. The rules, for lack of a better description. I don't know what else to call it, Nature has rules. There's these rules to nature, Art may not have rules. But if you know the rules of nature, then it can be to your advantage to use them in your art. Now I'd probably want to break out a small brush to do the real distant waves here, Smaller, 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 and then when I get to this horizon, I really shouldn't even have any waves on that very edge. It should just be more of a solid color where they disappear to the size of 0. When I was painting a pirate ship scene over at the Flagstaff Medical Center, I posted a YouTube video, how to paint ocean water. And on that one, I'm using a wet on dry technique. Same knowledge, same principle, but just a quick shortcut method to getting the same look of these kinds of waves. And so that's a little different than doing this wet on wet where I'm blending it. The technique is not what matters. What matters is understanding what the natural look is and how your strategy of getting to that proper shape and color placement is going to be. Now that I have this, I'm going to show you a little bit more on making the waves more complex and adding other colors to make it look more like translucent water with light shining in it.